Hi and welcome to this webinar on Node.js at Edureka. My name is Andy Sen and I am the CTO, part of the development team that handles the entire technology platform. A little bit about myself. I've been in this industry for about 15 years, started out with a computer science degree from IIT Kharagpur, and I've seen a lot of technology and frameworks over the last decade and a half. We have seen PHP, we have seen Java, .NET, and one of the most recent and hottest new emerging technologies, is Node.js, which has emerged to 4 years as a very strong contender for building really scalable platforms. What we will cover in this webinar is a glimpse into what Node.js is, and we'll look at a very simple application. I hope everybody can hear me clearly and you are able to see my screen. If you can just type out your confirmation, we will proceed. All right. So in this webinar, we'll look at NPM, we'll look at Node.js Express, we'll take a brief look at templates, and we'll look at a simple RESTful web application in Node.js. All right. What is Node.js? I'm sure a lot of you may have already heard the term, which is why you're probably here. It's essentially an open source cross-platform runtime environment. Now that sounds like a lot of words, but what Node.js allows you to do is write code in JavaScript, which can be run on almost any platform. So right now, we support OS X. Obviously, you have Linux and even Unix and Linux variants. In fact, some of you may or may not be familiar with the Raspberry Pi, which runs on an ARM architecture. Even that can run Node.js. The premise of Node.js was based on Google's V8 JavaScript engine, and it's actually very suited for server-side deployments to create very large scalable applications, and we'll take a look at that. Some of you may be thinking that, oh, this is JavaScript. I already know what this is all about. Node.js is more than just JavaScript. Yes, JavaScript is the language of choice, but Node.js allows you to use sockets. It allows you to use connections and a lot of other features, which you'll get to know once you do the course. Okay. So one of the most important features about Node.js is it's single-threaded. Yes, you heard it right. It is a single-threaded architecture. And what this allows you to do is you don't have to worry about things like race conditions, deadlocks, and other problems that go with multi-threading. Let me explain why the designers and the philosophy behind the people who chose Node.js decided to make it single-threaded. The designers essentially realized that most of the delay that comes in large scalable computing apps actually comes from I/O. So most of the time the CPU is actually waiting for I/O. So what they decided that all the blocking I/O requests would be sent off to a separate thread pool, and the entire core server architecture would be running under an event, which will be processing the event in a single loop. Now what this means is, because it is event driven and it does not do any blocking I/O, that is, even something like writing to a file is sent as an asynchronous call, right? This allows you to very rapidly scale a Node.js application. Let us take an example of Apache. Most of you are probably familiar with the Apache web server. The way Apache works is every time there's a connection, and based on the configuration, either Apache will fork a new process or it will start a new thread. So what this happens is, if you have, say, 500 connections, it actually starts off 500 threads, which instantly becomes a problem for the server. Whereas in Node.js, everything is event-driven. Everything runs on a single thread. So you actually have the main thread handling all the requests. So almost no function in Node directly performs I/O, so the server never blocks. And because it never blocks, you can have your app develop scalable systems. Now, NPM used to be Node Package Manager, but it's not. It allows you to install Node dependencies. It allows you to install almost any application, open source application, which has been developed with Node. And what this also allows you to do is now it has become kind of a generic package manager. So some of you may be familiar with OS level package managers such as apt on Debian and Ubuntu, and Yum on CentOS. So similarly, NPM is a package manager. You have reusable modules and packages written by various developers, and you can even publish your own NPM packages. Typically, there are two ways we install NPM packages. You can install it locally, which is, and we'll see an example of that, where we'll just put it in a folder and install it on my own modular project. And then you can use it globally, where it kind of installs it across all users across the server. So I'm hoping that everyone so far is following what I'm saying. Again, if you have any questions or if you need a clarification, please type it out in the questions window, and I will take on the requests as they come in. So we'll look at a couple of use cases of Node.js. Walmart actually came to the conclusion that using a new technology like Node.js was far more beneficial than any inherent risk. Now, typically when a new technology comes out, you have frameworks which don't support them. You may not have full code, but Node.js is actually quite old in the sense, it's already been around for several years, and Walmart decided to go down that path. What they did was they re-engineered their mobile app to run on Node.js, where all the front-end code gets executed on the back-end. And what their VP of mobile architecture says is, because Walmart actually rely on services from a lot of vendors, from a lot of service providers, right? What they have built is they've actually built a node layer as a front end to those services, and it allows to scale those services very, very well. Okay, excellent. We have a question from Bhupesh, who has asked, Node.js versus AngularJS. Node.js is actually a server-side application. What Node.js allows you to do is create server-side JavaScript applications. It allows you to actually create WebSockets which will serve out content. It allows you to serve out content. It give out templates. It allows you to give out views and so on. AngularJS is almost exclusively on the front end. There is some amount of overlap. For example, if you use Node.js with something like Jade, which will have routing, it's going to have a controller. But AngularJS almost exclusively is used for creating single-page applications. You will be making calls mostly from your browser on the client side. So there is some amount of overlap. AngularJS does not have a backend part to it. You're not going to use AngularJS to actually create the REST backend, which you can typically do with any technology, whether it is Node.js, whether it is Cake PHP, or even Java or .NET. So we have a question as well. If Node.js is single-threaded, is there a bottleneck in supporting concurrent number of? Is there a performance benchmark that you can share? So because it is single-threaded, the design philosophy is we try not to do CPU intensive tasks. If you have computations, if you have intensive CPU computations, those are typically not suited for a Node.js kind of application. So Node.js has come out with a web worker kind of a concept where CPU intensive tasks can be spawned off, but typically CPU intensive tasks are not expected in Node.js. Usually things like rendering, front ends, or getting, bringing out your templates and so on are very, very well handled in Node.js. But something like, if you want to encode an image, resize an image, maybe not so well suited for Node.js unless you're using web workers and so on, and which we're not going to cover in this part of the presentation. Now, is there a bottleneck in supporting concurrent number of requests? There's not, because what happens is when you do a typical I/O, so for example, if there's a Node.js call, and if you're making say a SQL query, what's going to happen is you spin off the SQL query as an asynchronous call, which means that the SQL query is kind of sent, and the main thread continues processing the other requests. Once a SQL query finishes and reverts, then you get a callback function, which you typically write a callback function when you send the async request, and that callback function is called in Node.js. So what this allows you to do, serve multiple requests, and you do not have the overhead of switching threads, and you do not have the overhead of context switching that is typically associated with both threads and with process forks. Coming back to our presentation. So we've seen Walmart use Node.js. Now we will look at another example, LinkedIn, who is also heavily using Node.js. Most of you may have used the LinkedIn mobile and tablet application. You'll be very, very surprised to know that 95% of the application is actually HTML5 and web-based. That is right. Most of the application is actually a container calling web pages HTML5 content of their site. They have an application, yes, an Android app and an iPad app. It does a basic function, but 95% of the app is web-based. And it's because of the speed of Node.js and the fact that you can run, actually deal with front-end code on the back end has allowed them to actually build an application or architect this application in this manner. So what they've actually done is now they've actually increased the number of users and events they can handle on this using this particular technology. In fact, event-driven technology is not new. If you look at Nginx, some of you may be familiar with Nginx, which is a web server. Nginx has always employed the event structure when handling with HTTP requests. And what this has allowed Nginx to do is it is allowed to serve far more number of requests than Apache. Typically, when you run Apache, your server is going to start crawling after you have, obviously based on how much RAM and CPU you have, but it'll start crawling compared to a similar server running Nginx. And Node.js has the same philosophy, but obviously not only incorporates a very nice backend written in JavaScript, but also a large number of libraries which will allow applications natively. Over JavaScript, does Node.js have only one advantage, that it executes requests efficiently? Tanmay asks. Okay. So it's not over JavaScript really, Tanmay. What this does, what Node.js does is, JavaScript is a language in which Node.js actually processes, right? So Node.js, the philosophy behind Node.js is we single single-threaded server model, and they use JavaScript. And remember, I spoke about Google's V8 JavaScript engine. So what Google's V8 JavaScript engine actually does is it actually compiles the JavaScript into machine and assembly code. So this is actually, I'm not sure how many of you are aware of this, but because of this, it gives you a sizable improvement in the JavaScript execution as opposed to if you were natively running JavaScript. When you natively run JavaScript or even Perl or PHP, you interpret the code. It's not really bytecode, right? But the V8 engine actually compiles, and when I say compile, it does it dynamically on the runtime. It compiles your JavaScript code into a machine binary specific to the machine on which it's running. All right. And we'll look at one more specific use case. So Voxer, when they first built it out, their CTO ran a test, and this is coming back to one of the questions that's asked, at how many connections he could open on a single server using Node.js. And he decided to open as many connections as he could, just to see where things would fall down, when would the server break. And what he found out that with Node, he could open all of them. So he used up all his available ports. Now, as you may know, you're actually allowed to use up only, and I say only, in a small term, 65,535 ports on a single machine, right? That's 65. So Node, he actually exhausted all the 65K ports using a single process. And because it is so memory efficient, he just found it astounding. So if we look at the the advantages of using Node, right? I mean, we can build server-side applications. It's highly scalable, with a low memory consumption. And on top of that, you have a vibrant community support. You have a lot of, ready-made packages, which ensures that this works out. Okay, I've also, there's some questions around benchmarks, around X number of requests. So what I'm going to do for this is I'm just going to note this down, and what we will do is after the webinar, we'll send out some of these benchmarks where you actually compare, performance of Node, versus performance of, say, a similar backend architecture. Okay. So is Node.js good for concurrent? Absolutely. And the way you write it out is like we just explained in this particular use case. It's very well suited for concurrent request handling. And not only that, because it's scalable, it is simple to scale. You can add as many servers as you want, and you actually will get more bang for your buck. You're going to get a very efficient server usage for using Node.js. Okay. JS. Now, so we spoke about Node. We spoke about how Node was a server-side architecture, and now we're going to look at a web framework, which is Express.js. However, before I go into Express.js, I just want to make sure that I've answered your questions. If people have more questions, again, feel free to jot them down, and I'll take care of them. Okay. So we have an interesting question. Can Node replace any Java stack? What I mean is, can I build a web application for which I was planning to use Java, Hibernate, Spring, etc., and Node instead? So the answer is, of course, yes, you can. The way Node actually works, and if you look at the existing Node package libraries, right? Node is again a backend server framework which will do, which can do almost everything that you can do in Java. Now, apart from the fact, obviously, if you don't know JavaScript, you have to get familiar with the language. But apart from that, right? If you're using, say, traditional Java J2E, in which you are using Hibernate, Spring, you can use similar frameworks using Node.js and build out your application. In fact, if you look at, we'll look at a sample application, you can actually design, build, and iterate over your code faster in Node.js and JavaScript than you would be able to do using pure Java. Again, these are very two different paradigms, different architectures. So people are comfortable with Java because it's been around for almost 20 years now. It's been around for a long time. It's battle tested. Everything from our IRCTC website to ICICI's website run on Java. But if you look at some of the newer websites, and especially some of the backend processing that goes on with mobile applications, they almost exclusively run on Node.js. So people are hesitant to move their existing applications from Java. Almost all of the new applications, or even the backend processing, especially for mobile apps, especially for creating RESTful APIs, people are actually turning to Node.js simply because it's so efficient. Earlier, and I can tell you this from an example, right? We worked with a client who was handling transactions, and this was a casino company. They were handling transactions, so they had a Unix box running Java, and just to and this is about, I think, 8 years back, to process about 10 to 20 transactions. They had a server which ran on 16 gigs, and they had like 4 processors and so on, and that's very, very expensive, not just in terms of money, but even in terms of server hardware and maintenance and so on, right? If you look at it now, right, a typical Node.js running on, say, a quad-core, one of the Intel Xeon servers with 8 GB of RAM can easily process 100 to 500 transactions a second, easily. Obviously, based on it's obviously a lot dependent on what those transactions are, but the scale you get with no. Oops. Okay. So sorry. So Express.js, which is essentially a web framework for Node.js, and I'm going to actually shift over. So I've installed Node.js on an Ubuntu box. You may decide to do it on Windows as well. There are easy installers for that. And I already have Express pre-installed. So we're not going to go through the installation, but you should be able to see my screen where I have Ubuntu running. Okay. So what we will do over here is we will create a very simple Express application. So if I go Express, sorry, let me see what I have. I do have Hello World. I'm just going to remove the Hello World app. Okay. So what this has done is this has created a basic installation framework and an application called, it has created some prepackaged folders. There's a package.json, which we're not going to cover in detail now, but it simply says how we can, what are the dependencies for this application, what are the libraries required. And, it has created a couple of public folders. It has created something called routes and something called views, which, people who are familiar with the MVC architecture may know. Now what I'll do is I'll go to Hello World, right? And npm install. So what this does, and as you can see, is based on Express again, which is a web framework, it actually gets all the required packages that are done. And because if you see I've done npm install, it's getting the packages only specific to this directory. So I'm not touching anything else. I'm not breaking any other installation. So I've been able to create a project. I'm able to get libraries which run only in the specific folder. And this is again very, very nice and very, very powerful. You have tried doing this in PHP on Perl, where you do server-side installs, where you install it on the full server, and it kind of breaks everybody else's installation. Okay. Now, once we have done this, I'm quickly going to shift over to my. So I'm just using basic, a basic ID, Notepad++. Some of you may be familiar with it. So I'll go to Hello World, but app.js. Sorry. There you go. So this is the default one. I'm just going to actually replace it with a very, very simple Hello World application. So what you can see over here is in the app.js, where I'm saying, get the Express application. And what I'm saying is, create an application where Express is creating a server. So a very basic server. I have actually defined a route here, the simplest route, where it says, for my root, I have defined an anonymous function with request, which takes in request and response. The first parameter is the request REQ, and then the response. And in the response, I'm simply sending hello world with a couple of HTML tags. And then thing, create a server, listen on port 8080, and simply console.log that I am listening to this server over here. So what we will do over here is, after installing, go Node. So just a quick brief about Ubuntu. When you actually install Node.js on Ubuntu, you may have to type Node.js, right? So as you can see, I'm using version. So what I've done is I've created a symlink to Node, because a lot of the packages will require you to type Node instead of Node.js. Because of Ubuntu's package management, there's a name conflict, so you can't install it with Node. You have to install it with Node.js, but you can simply create a symlink with the name Node to help you with package installations. Again, we will cover these intricacies, as a part, and these kind of intricacies will be explained to you in the installation guide specific to the operating system when you take the course. Okay, so what we have seen so far is we use Express to create a basic template, we have replaced the main application JS with a very, very simple Node backend with a very simple route, which says, when I do a request, a get function for the root, simply send hello world and listen on port 8080. What I will do now is go node app, and it says, the Express server is listening on port 8080 in dev mode. Just gonna go 1.2.40.80, and there you go. It's a very, very simple example. It simply prints out hello world, but as we all know, this is how it essentially starts. All right. So we've looked at a very simple example. So as you can see, so somebody was asking me about Java. Now I know that if you're using, maybe Tomcat, it's easier now with servlets and so on. But if you look at it with NPM and Node.js, you have a server running. You've defined a static route over here, and you're sending it out. And this allows you to actually create, easily create RESTful applications. Now, obviously, I'm not advocating you put in all your routes in a single file, but this allows you to very, very simply create routes and create, REST services, using Node. Okay, I'm going to now stop the server. Now we will look at a more involved example of Node. So I have a question from Vamsi as well, a very interesting one. If an application needs transaction support, can we use Node.js? Now bear in mind that Node.js by itself does not do the transaction. Now typically for transactional systems, you are going to use a database of some kind. You are going to be using either, you could be using Oracle, you could be using SQL, MySQL. If you're a fan of NoSQL, you'll go Cassandra and so on. So the question, the short answer to Vamsi's question is absolutely you can use transaction support, because your transactional support is going to be provided by your backend system. Now let's take an example as to what happens. Suppose a customer purchases something and does an action. He clicks on submit or clicks on buy or something along those lines. That express is sent off to Node.js. That particular action is sent off to Node.js. This will send off an asynchronous call to the server. And what typically will happen on your front end is you're going to have a loader spinning. Right, you're going to have a loader spinning, while the transactional system, which could be MySQL, which could be anything, does its task. When the transactional system comes back with an answer with a positive confirmation, right? You can send that confirmation back to the front end, and the spinner stops, and you see the confirmation success message. Or, what we're going to be looking at is, alternatively, if your confirmation times out, you can have a timeout function set in your JavaScript itself, so that if you don't get the confirmation, you can simply say that a confirmation has failed and take it on from there. But the beauty is, while you are seeing the spinner, the actual Node.js application thread has moved on and was able to service maybe 50 other clients, right, while padding off the request, the transactional request to the database system. So I hope that answers the question, Vamsi, in terms of that yes, an application can support, a Node.js application can support transactions. It's just that you have to be clear to the user on how you actually do it. A traditional app using PHP, you would send the request, that particular connection would wait, it would poll and come back. But here it's kind of just sent off, and once the confirmation comes in, or if it times out, that message is given to the user. Okay. So the question is, event processors will process I/O events parallelly. Yeah, yes. So the way it happens is the I/O events themselves are sent off to a thread pool. So so what the Node.js event will do is any I/O specific event, any I/O call. So say you're writing to a file as an asynchronous call and give a callback function, and that will be sent off. So yes, it kind of what it does is Node is still using threads internally. It uses something called lib event to manage its internal threading stuff. But the main core thread itself is, runs in a single loop. I hope, I've been able to answer that question, Vamshi. Okay, so I'm just going to, move on. And so we'll just come back to our example. Vamshi, I'll come back to you and maybe we can have a discussion on this, after the webinar as well. And, what I'll do is actually I'll send you, something along the lines which will answer your question around how, how Node.js is actually more efficient as compared to a, traditional client server using threads. Okay, so we looked at a very simple example. Right now we'll look at a slightly more involved example, which involves, routes and so on. So before I do that, what I'm going to do is we will see how easy. So for example, I use the hello world, right? I'm just going to edit it right here. If you see package.json, which is essentially a way for my application to show you, what I've used. So what I'm saying here is now my application hello world has a dependency on socket.io, and I'm saying, I need the latest version of socket.io, that is. So once I've added it to my package.json, I go npm install. So it's actually going to install, socket.io right over there. So you can see it's getting it in real time and installing it out. And I have it ready. Now what I'm going to do next is I've opened up my app.js. This is the main app.js, and again I'm going to put in a template, and this will be more familiar to people who have again over here I'm saying I need express, I need route, I need an HTTP server, and I also need socket.io. I'm listening on port 3000, and I've created a server, and I've basically configured my application where I'm saying, my view engine is Jade. I am using, please use the views folder to pick up my views. My static content can be fetched from my public folder, and then, a couple of other, router and other functionality I'm using Jade, right? And then, I've said connection, and one of the main things that I do is, if you see io.line right here on line 32, once you have a connect, I get the address of the remote, and I say a new user has connected from this address. So before I go on with this example, I'm just going to quickly skip back to the presentation. So we've looked at Express.js, we've looked at the web frame. We've looked at npm package manager, right? And we're going to look at Jade template right now, and I'm going to talk about what is Jade. Jade is essentially a framework. It helps bind data. So in a way, it's a view and a templating engine that you can use with Node.js. So it helps you easily bind the data from the backend to the HTML view. You can use reusable modules and layouts, very similar to MVC, and basic conditions, iterations, loops, and so on. So there are a lot of JavaScript templating engines available, and we're just going to take a very, very brief look at Jade in this webinar. So Jade is a simple JavaScript templating engine. No config has to be set up. We saw it was available. It supports dynamic code, and it has template inheritance, which is a very powerful feature. You can have a master template and kind of inherit different templates based on the master template, and then it allows you to come into reusable functions that can run into server. Now, this is a very powerful feature and allows you to actually create templates which will run on web clients which are not very, very powerful. This allows you to actually create nice HTML applications which will run on low-end smartphones. If you are using something like pure Angular or pure HTML5 JavaScript, you will run into a problem when you go on a low end or even on a medium-sized smartphone where you feel that your web page has become sluggish and JavaScript are taking time. Here we are looking at an example of Jade syntax. It's very straightforward. HTML head, you give a title, we have a body, we give the type h1 header 1, we give a div, a paragraph, some content, and so on. And as you can see, Jade will simply render it into plain HTML. Tabs and spaces are very important for Jade. Do not mix tabs and spaces. Jade, in a way, is like Python, where the indentation makes a difference. Okay, we have a question where we're saying that who will be taking the Node.js course from a user who has already completed the Hadoop course. So we will actually have industry experts who take our courses. So whoever, the person who will be taking the Node.js course is someone who's actually used Node.js and who's actually deployed applications and worked on actual commercial projects using Node.js. So whatever you learn from instructor is actually the best practice that is followed in the in the real world out there. These are not just academic exercises. You are going to be actually looking at the project will actually be a real world scenario, and you will be taught real world concepts, the pain points that they have faced, and what they did to handle those points. So, and not only that, one of our features is if you've taken our course and say even 2 months or 3 months or 4 months later, say a Node.js application or deployment for a client or for your employer, and you run into a problem, even at that point in time, you can get in touch with our support and say, hey, look, I'm trying to do this, and I'm facing this problem. Can you help me out? And our support team will take care of your request. And if it's even if it's complex, we will actually escalate it to the instructor, who will take a look at your request and help you out with that. So that is the kind of support you expect to get from us, if you go on our courses. Okay, so coming back to Jade, so we've seen how a simple Jade example where we are converting a Jade view or template into HTML. So this was a simple example of Hello World, and we are doing something a little bit more complex. And as you can see over here, it requires express. We define a simple route. We send Hello World. We've looked at this in the previous example. So before we do that, so I'm just going to finish out the example we started on. So we defined a simple route. So over here, as you can see, once a socket is connected, I take the handshake address, and and I simply say this is a welcome message from Node.js. What I'm going to do next is JS. So you guys can see my screen. So this is simply a client JavaScript. Now this will actually run on my browser. So the script you see over here, I'm just going to show it up again. It's a simple socket connect, and it just says, this will be sent actually to the browser. We'll see it once we get there. So this will be running on the browser, which is why I've kept it in the JavaScript folder. And finally, I'm going to, in the view, so in the view, in the Jade view, all I've said is, please include this particular JavaScript, socket.io and client.js. Once I've done that, So I run Node. It's running on port 3000. Just gonna open a new one. Right? As you can see, it says welcome to Express. Sorry, I think I have made just 1 second. There's a little typo over there. Forgot the slash. There we go. App. Reload. So you can see the welcome to Express. This is rendered by the Jade template. And if you look at my console, you can see that I've actually gotten a JavaScript object back where it says simply this is a welcome message from Node.js. So if you see this message over here, right now I'm simply printing it on to the console. But if you look at the app.js over here, where we were emitting a JavaScript object, so JSON, in the JSON notation saying that this is a welcome message. So what we see over here is we've used a simple Jade template. We've used io.sockets. We are actually able to install io.sockets in a very, very simple manner, make an npm installation. We've used a Jade template to render, create a view where we are loading the JavaScript. So this is the client-side JavaScript, which is sent with the view, which makes a connection, and then based on the connection, it sends out a message. So I hope you guys, are able to follow. I understand it may be a little bit quick in terms of what we can cover in a webinar, but essentially the installation steps are very straightforward. And if you like, we can obviously send you these examples and send you further documentation and further steps if you want to know a little bit more about them. Our course, we will obviously cover a lot of it in depth. Now, before we end this, I'm going to show you another very simple example which I've put up, which is a simple chat server, which we've you can find a lot of examples on GitHub. So if you go to GitHub, you're going to find a lot of packages, a lot of examples using Node.js, a lot of real-world applications and frameworks, templating frameworks, and so on. So the amount of community support that you'll find with Node.js is simply astounding, given that how new Node.js is. So I'm not going to go through the setup of the chat application. We will simply run the chat server. So as you can see, the chat server is running on 1337. So what we'll do over here is, oops, sorry. Okay, so just a little bit example. I'm just going to explain this chat application in a little bit more detail. What the application does is it's not using Express. It's not using Jade. It is a pure Node.js server. So the actual chat.html, and I can can look at the source code, right? Is a simple HTML which has it's calling frontend.js, wherein actually lies the main WebSocket. Now, obviously, I don't expect you to go through this in about the 5 seconds, but the actual chat.html is being served by Apache, which has the client JavaScript coming here, right? Pure Node.js application. So say if I'm signed in as Andy, and I'm going to go to a different one where I sign in as Vinny. So if I'm typing here, hello. So as you can see it from there. So what this does is, so what this simple application is doing is it's sending the request to the Node backend, and what simply the Node server is doing is sending it back out to a different WebSocket, and everything is being shown on an HTML page. So this is a very, very simple example using WebSockets. You can find this example in GitHub. It just shows that how easy and how quick it is to build such applications once you're aware of the fundamentals of Node.js. Okay, Naresh again asks a very interesting question where he's Naresh has actually seems to have used socket.io implement to broadcast a message to thousands of connections. It takes longer than expected. Is there a best socket.io implementation? There are several socket.io implementations. Now, when it comes to saying which one is the best, it's a little bit hard at this point because we do not know, Naresh, I do not know the specific way you have actually implemented this broadcast. Now, typically, you can easily have several hundred, connections to a single server, right? The way you actually use socket.io implementations is actually you scale your web server. So you have, standard commodity virtual servers, maybe running 4 gigs or 8 gigs. And then you say that, okay, each one of those servers will actually take on, a few thousand. So you do a couple of benchmarks and you see what kind of latency for broadcast is acceptable to you. Yes, you will find that there is a certain latency. There is a certain, even lib event has its limitations, amount of latency. So when you do a stress test, you will find that at X thousand clients, my particular server reaches my level of acceptable latency. So if my acceptable latency is 1 second or 2 seconds, you will find that for this particular server, this particular network, maybe, I can only support 2,000 or 4,000 or 5,000 clients on this server. So that is one way, we do it. So Naresh says that, he had implemented it for WebSocket and it takes a lot of time for iterating through each connection. So Naresh, I'm not sure whether you used pure WebSockets or whether you used Node.js. Did you use Angular? Did you use something? So this is another interesting question. We can take a look at it and, we'll come back to you, after the webinar. We can even have a separate conversation if you want, and to find out what is it that you use and what kind of latencies you see. Because see, bear in mind, a lot of this is dependent on the network. Unless you actually have 100 or even 1,000 clients, typically we impose artificial loads by making 1,000 connections from a single machine, and that is usually not the best case scenario. Normally what I advocate to people is use an app like Load Runner. So there are actually pay-as-you-go apps which will simulate real 1,000 connections from different IP addresses and different machines, and you may see actually different results over there. Again, Naresh, we can actually talk about your case when we come to it, and I'll be happy to go on a conversation with you. So we've seen the basics of an application. We have seen, how Node.js works. We have seen, how to use a templating engine. We have seen a pure Node example where we've simply written a web server. Again, all of these assets, we can send to you as an email. Just drop us a request, drop us an email. We can come back to you on that. So lastly, but not least, Node.js is in huge demand, right? The number of jobs are skyrocketing. Any and every startup that I know of in Bangalore is looking for people who know Mongo and who know some kind of an event-driven architecture, who can work with Node, who can work with, Mongo. So if at this point, if you, have not learned server-side JavaScript, I strongly recommend, that you do so, because if you look at the number of B2C products that are out there, almost every one of them, will, if not, they will start using it, right? If you have an application that you want to scale, you want to have, hundreds of thousands, lakhs of users, right? You will mostly not try to do it via the .NET or the Java route. .NET and Java is great for corporate and, corporate applications, for enterprise apps. In the B2C space, in e-commerce, whether you're creating a social application, whether you're writing an app on the back end, to scale things, you have to move towards an event-driven architecture. You have to move towards NoSQL. The other option is obviously throw money at it and buy, lots and lots of servers. But again, this is something which is, it has not only caught on, but it is actually becoming a requirement. So most people, whether they're CTOs or VPs of engineering, or even team leads, right? They will tend towards this. I mean, we already have the big ones like whether it's Amazon, Netflix, who have taken this route, and even some of the smaller startups actually run their backend architecture on these things.